The iron gates of Thorn Priory did not merely groan upon their hinges, they shrieked with the indignity of 2 decades of profound neglect. Verity stood before the massive stone edifice, her spine a column of rigid steel beneath a heavy coat of charcoal wool. She did not flinch as the damp English mist clung to her eyelashes, nor did she recoil from the smell of wet earth and rot that rose from the overgrown boxwood hedges. She was 30 years old, her fingers perpetually stained with the soot of old archives and the ink of architectural vellum, and she had long ago traded the soft fancies of her sex for the cold certainty of mathematics. The Priory was not a house. It was a contract of intent written in mortar and limestone, and it was currently screaming of a fraud she had yet to quantify. She adjusted the heavy leather satchel at her side, the weight of her surveyor's chain and brass calipers a comforting pressure against her hip. Behind her, the carriage that had brought her from the village rumbled away, leaving her in a silence so thick it felt like a physical shroud. The Priory was a sprawling, inconsistent monster of a manor, a hybrid of Tudor foundations and Regency ambitions. Verity did not look for ghosts. She did not listen for the whispers of a cursed family. She looked at the pitch of the roofline and the visible subsidence in the east wing, calculating the cost of restoration before she had even crossed the threshold. The heavy oak door was opened by a woman whose face was as grey as the bombazine of her dress. Mrs. Halloway did not offer a smile. She offered a curtsy so brief it was almost an insult. The housekeeper's eyes flickered to the travel-stained boots of the surveyor, and then to the rough, calloused palms she used to handle her instruments. Verity did not apologize for her appearance. She stepped into the main vestibule, her boots clicking with rhythmic precision on the cold marble floor, and immediately looked up at the vaulted ceiling to assess the load-bearing beams. The air inside the Priory tasted of beeswax and a sharp, cloying medicinal scent that sat uncomfortably beneath the smell of dust. Mrs. Halloway took her coat in silence, her movements mechanical and devoid of domestic warmth. Verity watched the woman's hands, noting how they trembled slightly. Every shadow in the entrance gallery seemed to lean inward, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for a ledger to be opened that had been sealed for 20 years. That evening, the first day of the survey, the architect was summoned to a dinner that felt more like an interrogation. The dining room was lit by a single chandelier that cast skeletal shadows across the mahogany table. At the head sat Arthur Sterling, the head executor of the estate, his presence suggesting a stewardship that was more of an occupation than a service. Beside him sat Julian, the Duke of Thorn. He looked like a statue carved from salt and sorrow. His skin was translucent, stretched thin over a high aristocratic brow, and his winter-grey eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance. The dinner was a display of curated silence. Each time Julian attempted to speak, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water, Sterling would lean forward, his voice a smooth, oily caress. "The Duke is tired," the executor would say. "His illness requires absolute quiet and the regular administration of his tonic." Verity watched the Duke closely. She did not look at his face. She observed the way his fingers twitched in a rhythmic pattern against the table, as if he were counting something only he could see. It was a matter of arithmetic, not of madness. When a shadow flickered across the wall, the Duke gasped, his eyes widening with sudden terror. Sterling immediately signaled to Mrs. Halloway, who appeared with a silver tray bearing a dark glass bottle. Julian swallowed the medicine without protest, his eyes glazing over almost instantly. It was a clinical tragic episode, recorded in the ledger of her mind as the first anomaly. The medicine was not a cure. It was a silencer designed to enforce compliance. The transition from observation to physical audit was grueling. By the third day, Verity had abandoned the social pretenses of the manor for the raw reality of the masonry. Her work was a silent, private art of survival. The house was vast, and her tools were heavy. She spent daylight hours, dragging her surveyor's chain across the damp flagstones of the lower domestic levels, the iron links clinking with a rhythmic finality against the stone. She climbed the scaffolding of the west wing with her theodolite, her breath blooming in the cold morning air as she sighted the angles of the cornices. The physical toll was a constant companion, an anchor against the oppressive atmosphere of the estate. The grit of the limestone embedded itself beneath her fingernails, and the bone-deep dampness of the English winter threatened to seize her joints. She did not complain, she did not falter. She measured, she calculated, and she verified. On the 9th afternoon, the true scale of the architectural deception began to reveal itself in the cellar. The air here was thick with the scent of mildew and oxidized copper. Thorn Priory had been fitted with an experimental steam heating system decades prior, a labyrinth of pipes designed to warm the vast stone floors above. Verity knelt on the frigid, packed earth ground, examining a massive brass steam valve covered in decades of grime. Setting her lantern aside, she gripped the freezing metal wheel with both hands, exerting the full force of her shoulders to turn it. The mechanism groaned in protest, finally giving way with a sharp hiss of released pressure. Verity stood and traced the hot, vibrating primary arterial pipe upward. It did not route toward the main drawing room or the master suites as logic dictated. Instead, it plunged directly into a solid, load-bearing stone wall at the blind end of the corridor. Verity pressed her ear flat against the rough-hewn masonry. Beneath the scent of wet stone, she felt a faint, rhythmic vibration, a hollow, steady hum. The steam was traveling into a void. The valve was a mechanical pulse feeding a hidden, parallel structure. The house was breathing in a space that did not officially exist. The house was a lie, a mathematical impossibility she unraveled over the following week. She discovered the blueprint discrepancy. While comparing the original vellum drawings from the archives to her physical measurements, unrolling the old charters of 1805 had felt like opening a crypt. The process required her to account for every joist and chimney breast. According to the original vellum blueprints, Thorn Priory encompassed exactly 46,000 square feet of livable space. However, when Verity meticulously calculated the internal dimensions of every accessible room and corridor, her internal physical survey accounted for only 40,000 square feet. The exterior perimeter, verified with her theodolite, matched the charters perfectly. A full 15% of the house's internal volume had been erased from the world within the walls. It was not a matter of architectural flair, it was a matter of deliberate omission. She found herself standing in a gallery, looking at a wall that should have been 6 inches thick, but was nearly 4 feet deep. Behind that plaster and lath lay the void, a hollow heart that the house had been forced to grow around. Sterling's presence was a constant, suffocating friction. He would often appear in doorways, questioning her progress with a mocking politeness. Verity did not engage in his games. She replied only with technical data regarding moisture levels and structural integrity, using her competence as a shield against his watchful eyes. She waited until the 17th night, when a heavy gale rattled the leaded glass windows and Sterling was occupied with estate business in the village. Bypassing the main library, she made her way to Sterling's private study in the East Wing. She did not look for a hidden safe, she looked for the architecture of secrecy. She noticed a slight misalignment in the mahogany shelving, a 3-inch discrepancy in the depth of a cabinet that suggested a cavity behind the drawers. With the steady hands of a surgeon, she manipulated the spring-loaded molding. The panel slid back with a dry, rasping sound. Inside was not gold, but paper. She found the Gaslight Ledger, a series of medical journals handwritten by Sterling himself. These were not records of health. They were logs of a meticulously maintained amnesia. Every entry documented the systematic erasure of a man's mind, detailing the sedatives administered to Julian over the last 20 years to enforce a curated fog. Each time the Duke claimed to see a physical presence in the corridors, a man he called his brother Silas, the dosage was increased in the ledger. Verity realized that the shadow Julian saw was not a ghost, but a tangible person he had been heavily sedated to forget. The 15% discrepancy in the masonry was a prison hidden in plain sight. On the night of the 21st day, the mist turned into a torrential downpour that rattled the windows of the library. Verity entered the room to find Julian sitting in the dark, the rhythmic ticking of a silver pocket watch on the desk the only sound. He looked like a man buried alive in his own heritage, his posture so stiff he seemed part of the chair. Measured by the ticking of the clock, his existence was barely a life at all. "Julian," she said, her voice level and devoid of breathy softness, "I have been auditing the physical dimensions of this house. Thorn Priory is missing 15% of itself. There is a grand discrepancy between the world outside and the rooms within. Someone has built a shadow house inside your walls. The Duke slowly turned his head. The movement was agonizingly slow, as if his neck were made of rusted iron. "The shadow is back," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. It had been missing for 20 years. Verity stepped closer, placing the original vellum blueprint directly over his folded hands. His lost reflection had vanished for 2 decades, reappearing the moment she touched him. It was an act of extreme social transgression, but she required his absolute focus. Her palm was rough, calloused from the Surveyor's chain, and warm against his cold, aristocratic skin. The grounding pressure of her fingers, the undeniable reality of her ink-stained skin against his, acted as a tether. She did not offer him platitudes. She did not wait for the medicine to fade. She anchored him to the present with the sheer physical weight of the evidence. The dull, sedative-induced fog in Julian's eyes did not vanish by magic. It receded under the blunt force of her intellectual certainty and the sharp, tactile shock of a hand that knew only labor. He blinked, his breathing hitching as the thick haze of the narcotic met the immovable wall of her logic. For the first time in an eternity, the pupils of his eyes constricted with sudden clarity. He looked at her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of tireless work, then down at the blueprint beneath them. "Look at the math, Julian," she said, her finger tracing the line of the outer wall on the vellum. "My chain does not lie. There are corridors behind the library shelves that do not appear on the maps. Dead boys do not require hidden corridors. They do not require a 15% discrepancy in the masonry. Silas is not a ghost." The Duke looked at her, and the tremulous twitching of his fingers finally stopped. He was not looking at a shadow anymore. He was looking at a woman who had brought the truth in the form of an audit. He stood up, his spine straightening for the first time in 2 decades. The silence of the library was no longer a shroud. It was the quiet before a storm. She did not offer him comfort. She offered him the truth. She led him toward the corner of the library, her fingers trailing along the cold oak paneling until she found the hollow resonance she had mapped days before. Together, they stood before the false shelf of encyclopedias, looking at the worn brass handle to the shadow wing hidden in the molding. The ledger of the Vane family was finally open, and Verity was ready to balance the accounts. The shadow was no longer a memory. It was a physical fact waiting behind the wood, and the work of restoration was only just beginning. The archives of Thorn Priory were located in a vaulted sub-basement where the air was perpetually 4 degrees colder than the rest of the manor. It was a space defined by the scent of calcified limestone, rotten twine, and the peculiar sweet metallic tang of ink that had long since oxidized against vellum. Verity Thorn did not carry a candle into these depths. She carried a heavy brass lantern with a faceted lens that cut through the gloom like a surveyor's light. To her, this was not a tomb of family history. It was a forensic site. She moved between the towering rows of cedar crates with the rhythmic, calculated gait of a woman who had spent half her life measuring the weight of secrets. Her fingers, perpetually stained with the charcoal dust of old ledgers, traced the spines of the boxes until she found the discrepancy she sought. A crate mislabeled as stable accounts, 1800 to 1810. The lid groaned as she pried it loose with the edge of her steel drafting ruler. Inside lay the missing chapters of a man's life, bound in flaking leather and tied with black silk ribbons. Verity did not search for letters of affection or romantic correspondence. She looked for the ledger of a systematic erasure. She sat on a low stone plinth, the lantern casting her shadow against the damp wall, and began the meticulous process of cross-referencing. These were the medical journals of the previous Duke's personal physician, a man who had been on Arthur Sterling's payroll until the day of his quiet retirement. As she turned the pages, the prose was clinical, cold, and devastating. The journals documented the febrile delusions of a 7-year-old Julian Vane following the death of his mother. Every mention of Silas, Julian's twin and shadow, was recorded not as a person, but as a symptom. Verity's eyes narrowed as she read the physician's instructions. The child persists in the belief of a twin. Administer the bromide twice daily. Should he speak of Silas, he is to be isolated in the darkened nursery until the hallucination recedes. It was a matter of chemistry, not of care. The documents revealed a decade-long project of psychological architecture, where a child's reality was dismantled brick by brick and replaced with a curated madness. She found a secondary folder tucked into the back of the crate, a collection of correspondence between the physician and a young Arthur Sterling. The handwriting in these letters was different. It was sharp, impatient, and devoid of the physician's professional veneer. Sterling had not been managing a tragedy, he had been constructing a vacancy. He had been the architect of Julian's isolation, ensuring that the heir to Thorn Priory would grow up believing his own memories were a betrayal of his mind. Verity did not feel a rush of pity. She felt a cold, sharpening resolve. She counted the number of times the word tonic appeared in the records. 1,460 times in the first 5 years alone. Each dose was a weight on the scales of justice that she was now beginning to balance. The most damning piece of evidence lay at the very bottom of the crate. A lock of dark hair tied with a scrap of blue ribbon, identical to the one Julian still wore in a locket. Beside it was a scrap of paper in a child's clumsy hand, addressed to Julian, begging him to come and find him in the shadow wing. The ink was faded, but the desperation was preserved in the fibers of the paper. Silas had not disappeared into the ether. He had been moved into the 15% of the house that Verity had identified as missing. The archives were not merely a collection of books, they were the blueprints of a crime. Verity closed the journal with a snap that echoed through the stone chamber. She did silence her lantern, her internal map of the house now perfectly aligned with the tragedy recorded in the ink. She was no longer just a surveyor of stone. She was the auditor of a stolen life. She returned to the library on the upper floor, her boots sounding a steady, rhythmic pulse against the polished mahogany of the staircase. The transition from the damp silence of the sub-basement to the oppressive, beeswax-scented air of the main house was jarring. Julian was still there, sitting in the same chair by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the dying embers. The silver pocket watch on the desk continued its relentless ticking, a measurement of a life being drained by the hour. Verity did not wait for him to acknowledge her presence. She walked directly to the desk and placed the physician's journals atop the velvet blotter, the heavy leather covers making a dull, final thud. Julian did not flinch, but his frosty grey gaze flickered toward the books. He looked at them with a profound, weary terror, as if he recognized the physical shape of his own trauma. The medicinal scent in the room was stronger now. Sterling had clearly visited while she was below, ensuring the Duke's evening tonic had been administered. Verity's fingers brushed the dark glass vial that sat on the tray beside him. It was not a medicine, it was a shackle. She did not throw it away. She did not scream for the housekeeper. She looked at Julian, her spine a straight, unyielding line. "Julian, look at these pages," she said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, grounding clarity. "These are not the records of a sick mind. These are the records of a managed estate. Sterling did not cure you. He edited you. Every time you remembered Silas, he bought another bottle of this liquid to ensure you forgot. Your madness is not a ghost, Julian. It is a ledger entry." The Duke's breathing became shallow, his chest hitching in a rhythmic, panicked stutter. He reached for the dark vial, his hand trembling so violently that the glass rattled against the silver tray. The dissociative fog that had defined his life for 20 years began to surge, a grey wall of narcotic defense rising to meet her truth. His eyes began to roll back, his consciousness retreating into the safe, numb darkness where Sterling had kept him for 2 decades. He began to murmur a name, Silas. But it was a plea to a hallucination, a surrender to the lie that his twin was only a shadow of his own making. Verity did not allow him to retreat. She did not call for help. She reached out and firmly grasped his hand, her rough, ink-stained palm clamping over his porcelain-thin wrist. Julian's twin had been concealed for a score of years. He returned the moment she touched him. The physical contact was not a gesture of romantic comfort. It was a sensory audit of the physical world. Her calluses, earned through years of hauling surveyors, chains, and climbing cold stone, acted as a grounding wire for his fracturing mind. She forced him to feel the warmth of her blood, the grit of the archive dust on her skin, and the undeniable reality of a living person standing before him. Julian's head snapped forward, his gaze locking onto hers with a sudden, violent intensity. The grey veil in his eyes shattered under the pressure of her touch. At long last, he was not looking at a phantom in the corner of the room. He was looking at the woman who was refusing to let him drown. He felt the weight of her hand, a physical anchor that was heavier and more real than 20 years of chemical fog. He let out a ragged, choked breath, and the trembling in his hand began to subside, replaced by a desperate, crushing grip on her fingers. The touch was a catalyst for a sudden, sharp clarity. Julian looked down at the journals on the desk, and finally he did not see symptoms. He saw words. He saw the dates, the dosages, and the cold, administrative tone of his own erasure. The repressed memories of Silas. The smell of the hidden corridors. The sound of a brother's laughter behind the library shelves. The specific texture of the blue ribbon. Collided with the logical evidence Verity had laid before him. The shadow he had seen for 20 years was no longer a wisp of smoke. It was a man with a name, a heart, and a physical location within the 15% of the house he had been forbidden to see. He looked up at her, and the winter grey of his eyes was no longer empty. It was filled with a cold, terrifying light. Verity did not move. She did not let go of his hand. She stood there, a silent architect of his awakening, as the Duke of Thorn finally began to count the cost of his silence. The silence was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. Together they looked toward the false shelf of encyclopedias, and the worn brass handle to the shadow wing seemed to pulse in the firelight. The work of restoration had ceased to be an architectural survey. It was now a hunt. Verity felt the pulse in Julian's wrist steadying, his heart settling into the same rhythmic pace as her own. She did not offer him a smile. She offered him the blueprints. She did not speak of hope. She spoke of logistics. The Duke stood up, his height finally matching the imposing scale of the library, his stature no longer diminished by the weight of the medicine. He looked at the journals, then at the dark vial of sedative. With a slow, deliberate movement, he swept the silver tray off the desk. The glass vial shattered against the stone hearth, the dark liquid hissing as it met the fire. It was not an outburst of emotion. It was an act of finality. The ledger of their lives was finally beginning to balance, and for the first time in 20 years, the Duke was not afraid of the dark. He was the one who was going to walk into it. Verity stepped back, her hand finally leaving his, but the grounding effect of the touch remained. She picked up her lantern, the light catching the ink on her fingers, the ink that had rewritten his fate. She did not ask if he was ready. She simply walked toward the corner of the room, her boots clicking with the precision of a clock, and placed her hand on the worn brass handle. The shadow was waiting, and the audit was about to move into the dark. The brass handle felt like a cold, immovable fact beneath Verity Thorn's calloused palm. In the dim light of her lantern, the metal did not gleam with the polished vanity of the drawing-room silver. It possessed the dull, oily sheen of something handled with frantic, repeated necessity. Verity did not immediately turn it. She was a woman of measurements, and a measurement required a baseline of absolute stillness. Behind her, the library of Thorn Priory seemed to contract, the towering mahogany shelves groaning under the weight of 10,000 volumes that had served as the walls of Julian Vane's prison. The air was thick with the scent of dying embers, and the sharp, acidic tang of the medicinal vial Julian had just shattered against the stone hearth. Gauged by the rhythmic beats of the silver pocket watch on the desk, the silence had lasted exactly 42 seconds, a duration of time in which the Duke of Thorn had ceased to be a patient and had begun to become a man. Julian's breathing was a rhythmic stutter in the gloom. Verity could feel the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the deathly chill that had defined his presence for the past 3 weeks. She did not turn to look at him yet. Instead, she traced the edge of the encyclopedia shelf with her left hand, her ink-stained fingers identifying the imperceptible misalignment in the wood where the panel met the load-bearing frame. To a casual observer, it was a flaw in the joinery. To an architectural surveyor, it was a hinge. The house was screaming its secrets to her, and she was the only one with the grammar to translate them. Suddenly, the Duke's breath hitched, a sharp, gasping sound that signaled the onset of a dissociative tremor. Verity heard the scrape of his boots against the rug as he swayed, his hands rising to claw at the air as if trying to tear away the invisible veil of the sedatives Arthur Sterling had used to shroud his mind. The grey fog was fighting to return, a chemical ghost clawing at the back of his throat. Julian began to murmur a name, Silas, but it was a sound of profound terror, the plea of a man who believed he was falling back into the abyss of his own perceived madness. Verity did not hesitate. She did not call for Mrs. Halloway, nor did she reach for a glass of water. She stepped back from the hidden door and firmly grasped Julian's right hand, her fingers locking around his wrist with the strength of a surveyor securing a chain. The Duke's shadow had been missing for 20 years. It returned the moment she touched him. The physical contact was an act of cold, clinical grounding. She forced him to feel the rough reality of her skin, the grit of the archive dust, and the heat of her own unyielding pulse. It was not a gesture of romantic comfort. It was a sensory audit of the present moment. She anchored him to the floorboards of the library, refusing to let his consciousness drift back into the curated amnesia of Sterling's ledger. Julian's head snapped toward her, his icy grey eyes wide and fixed on her face with the intensity of a drowning sailor grasping a pier. The tremors in his arm did not stop immediately, but they changed in nature, shifting from the erratic twitching of a victim to the vibrating tension of a man struggling to stand upright. He looked at her hand, his gaze tracing the ink stains on her knuckles and the calluses on her palm. He felt the weight of her presence, a physical fact that was heavier and more undeniable than 20 years of lies. The grey wall of the narcotic retreated, shattered by the blunt force of her touch and the mathematical certainty in her voice. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, level authority. "You are not in a dream, you are in the library of Thorn Priory. I am Verity Thorn, and I am holding your hand. Look at the brass handle. It is not a hallucination. It is metal, and it is worn from use." The Duke's eyes followed her gesture. He stared at the brass handle hidden in the molding of the shelf. In the sharp directional light of the lantern, the truth became a matter of physical evidence. Julian leaned forward, his breathing steadying as he noticed what Verity had seen days ago. A faint, circular pattern of wear on the wood surrounding the handle, a darkening of the finish where fingers had brushed against the oak thousands of times. A ghost does not leave oils from its skin upon a doorframe. A hallucination does not polish brass through 2 decades of friction. Julian let out a long, shuddering exhale, a sound that carried the weight of 20 years of suppressed grief. His grip on her hand tightened, not out of fear, but as a silent acknowledgement of their partnership. He was no longer a man questioning his own sanity. He was a man observing a crime. The silence in the library was no longer a shroud. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled with the truth. Verity felt the pulse in his wrist settle into a steady, rhythmic beat that matched the ticking of the clock. She released his hand, the grounding work done, and turned back to the door. The brass handle was not a door fixture. It was a physical testament to a 20-year betrayal. Verity gripped it and turned. The mechanism did not groan with the neglect of the main gates. It moved with a silent, well-oiled precision that turned her stomach. Arthur Sterling had been maintaining this entrance. The head executor had been walking through this wall while Julian sat 10 feet away, drugged into a stupor by Sterling's curated medical doses. The panel slid inward, revealing a narrow, vertical void that smelled of stale air, old wool, and the faint, unmistakable scent of tallow candles. They stepped through the threshold, leaving the beeswax-scented luxury of the library for the interstitial reality of the shadow wing. The space was a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, constructed between the inner lath and plaster walls and the heavy exterior masonry. It was a parallel house, a hidden architecture of surveillance and imprisonment. Verity raised her lantern, the light illuminating the floorboards. They were not dusty. They were swept clean by someone tasked with preserving a secret. Julian walked beside her, his hand brushing the rough stone of the outer wall, his face a mask of cold-focused rage. As they moved deeper into the hidden wing, the corridor opened into a small, windowless chamber built into the dead space behind the ballroom. Verity stopped, her lantern catching the details of a life lived in the dark. There was a narrow iron bed, neatly made with a grey wool blanket. A small wooden table sat in the corner, topped with a stack of books and a single half-melted candle in a pewter holder. On the wall hung a set of clothes, a simple wool coat and trousers, identical in cut to the ones Julian wore, but fashioned from a cheaper, sturdier fabric. This was the echo chamber. Every object in the room was a mirror of Julian's life, stripped of its title and its wealth. Verity walked to the table and picked up the book on top. It was a copy of Virgil's Aeneid. She opened the cover and saw a name written in the margin in a hand that was a haunting mirror image of the Duke's own, Silas Vane. Beneath the name, a date had been scrawled, September 14th, 1812. The shadow had been reading while the Duke had been sleeping. Julian stood in the center of the room, his hands trembling as he touched the wool of the coat hanging on the wall. He picked up a small wooden bird carved from a scrap of oak, a toy they had shared as children, long before the world was divided into the sick and the sane. The silence in the shadow wing was not an absence of sound. It was an accumulation of 20 years of unsaid words. Verity watched him, her spine a straight line of analytical observation. She was counting the years and the hours of this theft. It was a matter of records, not of hauntings. She found the journal tucked beneath the pillow of the iron bed. It was a simple, cloth-bound book, its pages filled with the daily observations of a man who had become a ghost by coercion. Verity opened it to a random entry and began to read aloud, her voice a steady pulse in the cramped room. May 12th, 1810, she read, her eyes tracking the ink. Sterling brought the food at midnight. He told me Julian screamed again today. He told me Julian's mind is a shattered glass, and that if I show my face, the shock will kill him. He says Julian hates the sight of me, that my presence is the poison that keeps him sick. I stay in the dark because I love him. I stay in the shadow so that he might one day walk in the sun. Julian let out a choked sound, a sob that he stifled with the back of his hand. He snatched the journal from her, his eyes devouring the words. He turned the pages, reading entry after entry of the same devastating lie. For 20 years, Silas had been told that Julian was a fragile madman who loathed him. For 20 years, Julian had been told that Silas was a hallucination of a diseased mind. Arthur Sterling had not merely separated two brothers. He had built a wall of mutual fabricated hatred between them, using their love for one another as the mortar. Verity did not offer him a handkerchief. She voiced nothing about the cruelty of the Thorne estate executors. She examined the floorboards, noticing a series of rhythmic scuff marks near the far wall. She walked toward them, her lantern illuminating a secondary smaller valve built into the floor, the same experimental steam system she had found in the sub-basement. She knelt and traced the pipe. It was warm. The shadow wing was being heated and maintained like a piece of fine machinery. Silas is not just a prisoner, Julian, she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, tactical deduction. He is an asset. Sterling kept him here as a backup heir, a shadow duke to be produced the moment you became too difficult to manage. He has been living 10 feet away from you, believing you were his executioner, while you believed he was a ghost. Julian looked at her, and the last of the medicinal fog vanished from his gaze, replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. He looked at the carved wooden bird in his hand, then at the hidden corridor that led further into the darkness of the house. He was no longer the Duke who had been missing his shadow. He was the man who was going to reclaim it. The ledger of Thorne Priory was finally beginning to balance, and Verity Thorne was ready to audit the final, hidden accounts of the Vane family. They did not speak. They did not wait. Together, they walked deeper into the shadow, the lantern light cutting a path through 20 years of lies. The air within the shadow wing did not possess the stagnant, heavy quality of a tomb. Instead, it moved with a faint, mechanical draft that tasted of cold iron and the dry, sweet scent of old paper. Verity Thorne held the lantern high, the faceted lens casting elongated, skeletal shadows that danced across the rough-hewn stone of the interior walls. She did not stumble. She did not whisper. She moved with the calculated precision of a surveyor entering a mapped territory, her boots striking the wooden floorboards with a rhythmic finality. Behind her, Julian Vane walked as if through a dream made flesh. The Duke did not reach out for the walls, yet his gaze was anchored to every junction of wood and stone, his mind clearly performing a frantic, silent audit of the space he had been told did not exist. The hallway was narrow, a vertical sliver of a house, squeezed between the grand library and the exterior masonry of the east wing. It was an architectural parasite, a parallel corridor designed to allow a ghost to walk 10 feet away from a man who believed he was alone. Verity stopped at the first threshold, her lantern illuminating a door that lacked a frame, camouflaged against the stone to vanish into the gloom. She did not ask for Julian's permission. She pressed her hand against the wood, noting the specific vibration of the house's experimental steam pipes beneath the floor. The shadow wing was not a series of rooms. It was a parallel history, built in the dark to sustain a crime of 20 years. This door, like the one in the library, bore the telltale darkening of the finish around the latch, the oil of human skin left behind by decades of clandestine use. Verity pushed it open. The chamber beyond was a meticulous, chilling mirror of Julian's own master suite. It was a masterpiece of domestic surveillance. The furniture was of the same period, the same wood, and the same proportions, but it lacked the gilding and the velvet of the Duke's quarters. Here the bed was a simple iron frame, the desk a sturdy oak table, and the carpet a plain woven wool. Verity paced the room, her eyes darting from the corners of the ceiling to the depth of the windowless alcoves. She was calculating the square footage, her mind comparing the physical reality of this room to the 15% discrepancy she had identified in the blueprints. Julian stepped into the room, and the silence seemed to grow heavier, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs. He stood before the desk, his frost-colored eyes fixed on a set of lead soldiers arranged in a perfect line across the wood. They were identical to a set he had kept in his nursery, a set he had believed had been lost in a fire the night his mother died. He did not touch them. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of rigid, aristocratic defense. Verity watched the way his throat moved as he swallowed, the only sign of the violent internal storm he was weathering. He was looking at the physical evidence of a brother who had been allowed to live in the dark, while he had been forced to sleep in the fog of sedatives, marked by the relentless cadence of the library timepiece, which was still audible as a faint, ghostly thrumming through the walls. They had been in the wing for 10 minutes. Verity walked to the bedside table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She searched for no ghosts. She examined the mechanics of survival. She found a small, discreet hatch built into the baseboard, a dumbwaiter system that connected to the lower kitchens. She knelt, her ink-stained fingers feeling the smooth pull of the rope. This was how Silas had been fed. This was how Arthur Sterling had managed the logistics of a living shadow. The house was a machine designed for isolation, and Sterling had been its primary operator. Julian finally spoke, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to catch on the dry air. "He has been here," he said, and the words were not a question. "He has been here, reading the same books, looking at the same toys, while I was being told my mind was a shattered glass. He believed I hated him, Verity. The journal said he stayed in the dark because he loved me." Verity stood up, her spine a straight, unyielding line of charcoal wool. She extended no platitudes about family or forgiveness. She offered him the logic of the architecture. "Silas was not just a brother, Julian," she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical clarity. "He was a reserve asset. Look at the mirroring of these rooms. Sterling kept him as a duplicate. If you died without an heir, or if your madness became too visible to the High Court, he could have produced Silas as the sane brother who had been away at school or traveling the continent. He was the ledger's insurance policy. A duke and a shadow, interchangeable at the executor's whim." She moved toward the desk, her lantern light falling upon a stack of vellum sheets and a silver inkwell. The ink was not dry. It was a deep, lustrous black, the same shade as the stains on Verity's own fingers. She set her lantern down, the light pooling on the surface of the wood, and began to sift through the papers with the rhythmic, calculated movements of an auditor. She sought no poetry. She sought no sketches. She looked for the final piece of evidence that would bridge the gap between the medical journals in the sub-basement and the living man in the wing. Near the bottom of the stack, she found a single sheet of paper, folded twice and addressed to Julian. It was not a formal letter. It was a message of desperate, whispered intent. The ink was smudged in places, as if the writer's hand had been trembling as the nib met the page. Verity did not read it immediately. She held it out to Julian, her calloused palm steady. The Duke reached for it, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second, a repetition of the grounding touch that had broken his fog in the library. He took the paper, and the silence in the room became absolute. Julian began to read, and as he did, the last of his cold, Duke-like composure shattered. The paper was an unsent letter, dated only 3 days prior. Verity watched his face, her analytical mind recording the micro-shifts in his expression. The tightening of his jaw, the sudden sharp intake of breath, and the way the grey of his eyes darkened until it matched the shadows in the room. The letter spoke of a conversation Silas had overheard through the ventilation ducts, a conversation between Arthur Sterling and Mrs. Halloway. Sterling had told the housekeeper that Julian's health was failing rapidly, and that the Duke had specifically requested that Silas never be mentioned again, calling his brother the source of his greatest shame. Silas had written to Julian one last time, begging for an explanation, offering to leave the priory and vanish forever if his presence truly caused Julian so much pain. He believed his brother considered him a burden, a stain upon the family name that needed to be erased. Julian's hand dropped to his side, the paper fluttering like a dying bird before he crumpled it in his fist. The sound was a sharp, rasping crack in the stillness. "He considered me a burden," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a rage that was 20 years in the making. He was told I loathed him. He was kept in this cage not by bars, but by the belief that his brother was his jailer. Verity did not look away. She provided no verbal comfort. She looked at the desk, noting a small brass steam valve built into the side of the table, a tactical mechanism of the house's heating system that Silas must have used to communicate through the pipes. She realized then that the voices Julian had heard in his drugged state were not hallucinations, they were Silas, calling out to him through the very bones of the house. Sterling had used the medicine to turn a brother's voice into a symptom of insanity. It was a matter of chemistry, used to enforce a social exile. "We are not just looking for a man, Julian," Verity said, her voice cutting through the heavy, emotional atmosphere like a drafting blade. "We are looking for the truth that Arthur Sterling cannot afford to let leave this house. If you and Silas stand together before the court, the trusteeship is dissolved. The executors lose their control over the Vane fortune, and the Shadow House becomes a testament to their fraud." She picked up her lantern, the light catching the determined set of her jaw. She did not wait for the Duke to recover. She moved toward the far end of the chamber, where the internal blueprints suggested the corridor continued toward the garden annex. Every step she took was a calculation, a measurement of the distance between the lie they had lived and the reckoning that was coming. The Duke followed her, his stride no longer hesitant. He was no longer the man missing his shadow. He was the man who had found the ink with which his history had been rewritten. The hallway beyond the bedroom narrowed significantly, the temperature dropping as they moved toward the exterior of the manor. The scent of damp earth and boxwood began to filter through the cracks in the masonry, suggesting they were approaching the secluded courtyard Silas used for exercise. Verity checked her internal map, counting the paces. The Shadow Wing was reaching its terminus. The architecture of secrecy was about to collide with the reality of a living man. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic clang echoed through the corridors, the sound of a heavy security shutter being dropped into place somewhere behind them. Verity froze, her lantern light swinging toward the way they had come. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of a trap being sprung. She did not panic. She did not scream. She stood perfectly still, her analytical mind already calculating the weight of the iron shutters and the pressure required to move them. "Sterling," Julian hissed, his hand moving to the hilt of a letter opener he had taken from the desk. The head executor had discovered their absence. The audit of Thorn Priory was no longer a matter of records and blueprints. It had become a struggle for the very air they breathed. Verity looked at the Duke, her ink-stained fingers tightening around the handle of her lantern. She did not fear the dark. She was the one who had measured its depth. She turned toward the garden annex, her boots clicking with a renewed, aggressive precision. They would find Silas, and then they would use the house itself to tear down the men who had built it as a prison. The ledger was not yet balanced, but the auditor was still in the room. The shriek of the iron shutters was not merely a noise. It was a structural finality that vibrated through the very soles of Verity Thorn's boots. She did not flinch, nor did she allow her lantern to waver, even as the heavy rhythmic thud of the security mechanisms signaled their enclosure within the Shadow Wing. To her analytical mind, the sound was a data point, a measurement of the sheer mass of the iron and the age of the gears maintained with such lethal efficiency by the estate's executors. She stood perfectly still in the narrow corridor, her ears counting the echoes of the metallic clangs as they rippled down the parallel hallway, identifying at least 4 points of obstruction between them and the library entrance. Behind her, Julian Vane's breathing had sharpened into the rapid, jagged pace of a man realizing the walls of his reality were physically closing in. "We must move toward the internal atrium," Verity said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, administrative clarity that cut through the Duke's mounting panic. She did not offer him a hand to hold. She offered him a direction. "The shutters are a matter of geography, Julian. Arthur Sterling has sealed the primary arteries, but he cannot rewrite the foundations of the house in a single moment. We have 30 yards to the courtyard threshold. Count the paces. Do not count the shadows." She turned and began to walk, her stride lengthening into an aggressive, methodical pace. The corridor here was colder, the air thick with the smell of wet limestone and the faint, bitter scent of dormant boxwood. They were moving toward the perimeter of the priory, where the shadow wing opened into a small, enclosed stone courtyard that served as a ventilation void. It was the only space where Silas could breathe the open air. The Duke followed her, his boots striking the floor with a hollow, desperate urgency. He was a man who had spent 20 years in a chemical fog, and the sharp reality of the falling barricades had acted as a second awakening, one flavored with the metallic tang of betrayal. The courtyard was not a garden. It was a sensory deprivation chamber of stone and moss, a pocket of forgotten air trapped within the lungs of the manor. As they breached the final doorway, the lantern's glow spilled across a space no larger than a ballroom, enclosed by walls of windowless masonry that rose 40 feet toward a sliver of grey sky. In the center of the space sat a single garden bench made of weathered teak, and upon that bench sat the man who had been the missing 15% of Julian's life. Silas Vane did not rise as they approached. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his posture a haunting mirror image of Julian's own stiff, aristocratic grace. In the flickering illumination, the resemblance was a physical shock that seemed to stop the air in the courtyard. Silas was thinner, his skin the color of parchment that had never seen the sun, and his hair was a shock of dark silk that fell over a brow identical to the Duke's. He did not look at Julian first. He looked at the lantern, his eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. Julian stopped 5 paces away, his frame vibrating with a tension so profound it seemed he might shatter. The carved wooden bird he had taken from the mirror suite was clutched so tightly in his hand that the wood groaned. "Silas," he whispered, and the name was not a plea, but a reclamation of a stolen fact. The man on the bench slowly raised his head, and the winter grey of his eyes met the winter grey of the Duke's. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the rhythmic drip of rainwater against the mossy flagstones. Silas did not speak of the 20 years of silence. He looked at Julian with a profound, weary recognition that transcended the lies Arthur Sterling had woven between them. He saw the Duke's fine wool coat, and then he saw the clarity in Julian's gaze, a clarity that Silas had been told was gone forever. "Sterling said you were lost," Silas said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that had the same timbre as the Duke's. "He said your mind was a library, with the lamps extinguished. He told me that if I ever touched the glass of your windows, the shock will kill you. He said you looked at my face and saw only the demon that haunted your dreams." Julian took a step forward until he was standing directly before his shadow. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the rough wool of Silas's sleeve. It was a matter of physical verification, an audit of the skin and bone that had been denied him. "I was told you were a ghost," Julian said, his voice thick with a rage finding its target. "I was told I had invented you to cope with a fever. For 20 years, I have been mourning a brother who was living 10 feet away from my bed." Verity Thorne stood at the edge of the courtyard, her lantern held steady as she watched the 2 men. She did not intervene. She was the one who had identified the missing lines in the ledger, but the reconciliation of the accounts belonged to the Vane family. She looked at the walls of the courtyard, her analytical mind already shifting back to the problem of the shutters. The silence of the reunion was a heavy emotional weight, but to Verity, it was merely the quiet before the next mechanical escalation. She noticed the way the moss had been meticulously cleared from a small section of the floor, a rhythmic, obsessive habit of a man with too much time and no purpose. "They lied to us both," "Silas," Julian said, his hand moving to his brother's shoulder, his grip tightening, as if he were trying to anchor them both to the earth. "He told me you were dead, and he told you I was mad. He used our love as the lock on our doors." Silas stood up then, his height matching Julian's perfectly. He finally looked at Verity, his gaze sharp and searching. "You are the architect," he said. "The one who has been measuring the walls for 3 weeks. I heard your chain against the stone. I heard the ticking of your instruments through the steam pipes. I thought you were another of Sterling's experts, sent to find a way to shrink my world even further." Verity met his gaze with a level, unyielding stare. "I am a surveyor, Mr. Vane," she replied, her voice crisp and devoid of sentiment. "I do not shrink worlds. I merely define their true boundaries. Thorn Priory had a 15% discrepancy in its heart. I do not like an unbalanced ledger, and I do not like a house that lies about its own volume." The moment of recognition was interrupted by the sound of boots on the other side of the courtyard's high wall, a rhythmic, authoritative clicking that Verity recognized instantly. It was the sound of ownership, the gait of a man who believed the law was merely a tool for his own convenience. Arthur Sterling had reached the perimeter. A shadow appeared in the narrow, barred gallery that overlooked the stone atrium from the 3rd floor, a vantage point used by the executors to monitor their prisoner. Sterling stood there, silhouetted against the internal glow of the manor, his hands resting on the iron railing. He looked down at the 3 of them with the cold, detached interest of a man observing a failed experiment. Beside him, the faint glimmer of a master key ring caught the glow, a heavy circle of brass and iron that represented the absolute control he held over the Priory's mechanisms. "It is a pity, Verity," Sterling said, his voice projected with a smooth resonance that echoed off the stone walls. "And I had hoped you were more interested in the subsidence of the East Wing than in the ghosts of the library. You are an exceptional surveyor, but you have a catastrophic lack of professional discretion. You have interfered with a 20-year management plan designed for the Duke's own protection." "Management?" Julian roared, his voice shaking the very air in the courtyard. "You drugged me for 20 years. You imprisoned my brother in the walls of my own house. You have stolen our lives and called it stewardship." Sterling did not flinch. He leaned over the railing, his face a mask of cold, administrative logic. The Vane estate was a chaotic mess of debts and ancient entitlements. "When I took over the trust, Julian, I brought order to this house. I turned a failing legacy into a profitable enterprise. To do that, I required a stable, compliant Duke. If that required a certain level of chemical intervention, it was a small price for the preservation of the Thorn name, and Silas was the redundancy. A backup heir should you prove truly unmanageable. It was a matter of insurance, nothing more." He signaled to someone unseen behind him, and the sound of the descending metal barriers began again. Verity looked up, her eyes tracking the movement of the heavy security plates as they began to slide over the single opening at the top of the courtyard. Sterling was not merely trapping them. He was sealing the Shadow Wing entirely, intending to erase the discrepancy from the world once and for all. "You cannot keep us here, Sterling," Verity said, her voice remaining level, even as the sky above began to vanish. "I have already sent my preliminary survey to the Architectural Oversight Committee. The 15% discrepancy is recorded. The gaslight ledger has been mapped. If we do not return, the audit will proceed without us." Sterling smiled, a thin, colorless line that did not reach his eyes. "The Oversight Committee is a collection of bureaucrats who haven't left their offices in a decade, Verity. And as for the ledgers, Fire is a very efficient auditor. By morning, Thorn Priory will have suffered a tragic accident in its outdated heating system. The Duke, his architect, and the hallucination he cherished will be part of the history of the rubble. It is a clean resolution to an unbalanced account." He turned to leave the gallery, the master key ring clinking with a final taunt. The iron shutters groaned as they met the stone sills, the last sliver of the grey English sky vanishing into a seam of black metal. The atrium was plunged into a darkness so absolute that the lantern's glow seemed to shrink. Verity did not move. She did not look for an exit. She turned her lantern toward the base of the walls, her mind already performing a rapid-fire sequence of calculations. She did not look for the steam valve. Wait, no. She looked for the steam valve. The courtyard was the terminus of the heating system. the point where the pressure from the sub-basement boiler was designed to be vented. Verity knelt on the cold ground, her ink-stained fingers feeling for the brass wheel she knew must be there. She found it hidden behind a loose stone near the bench, a heavy, industrial mechanism that felt like a cold kingdom under her hand. She did not try to turn it yet. She glanced at the Duke and Silas, the two brothers, standing together in the gloom. "He thinks he has sealed the ledger," Verity said, her voice a steady pulse in the dark. "He thinks he can burn the evidence of his fraud. But Arthur Sterling does not understand the architecture of this house. He has treated Thorn Priory as a cage, but it was built as an engine. And an engine, when pushed beyond its limits, does not merely break, it explodes." She gripped the brass valve with both hands, her calloused palms finding purchase on the metal. The Duke's shadow had been missing for 20 years, but the man had returned, and the auditor was still in the room. She did not count the fear. She counted the pressure. Verity Thorn was ready to turn the wheel. The audit was not over. It had merely reached the point of maximum friction. "We are going to use the shadow to bring down the house," she said. "Stand back. The restoration is about to become a reckoning." The brass wheel was not a mechanical fixture. It was a gavel of retribution, forged in the fires of a sub-basement boiler and chilled by 20 years of unacknowledged grief. Verity Thorn did not hesitate, nor did she allow the crushing weight of the iron shutters above to dampen the cold, mathematical fire in her soul. She knelt on the moss-slicked flagstones, her calloused palms finding the rough, industrial texture of the primary steam valve with a familiarity that surpassed mere touch. To her, this was an act of architectural surgery. She did not feel the dampness of the courtyard air or the frantic, echoing heartbeat of the two brothers behind her. She felt only the pressure, the immense, invisible force of the vapor currently roaring through the arterial pipes of Thorn Priory, held back by a series of regulators that Arthur Sterling believed he controlled. Verity understood the grammar of the house better than its master ever would. She knew that the shadow wing, being a parallel and hidden structure, relied on a specific, non-redundant distribution of heat to maintain its secrecy. It was a closed system, and every closed system has a point of catastrophic failure. She exerted the full force of her shoulders, her spine a column of unyielding steel as she forced the valve to turn against decades of calcified mineral deposits. The metal groaned, a deep, vibrating protest that resonated through the masonry like the growl of a waking beast. She did not stop. She did not falter. She turned the wheel exactly 3 full rotations to the left, bypassing the safety governors she had identified in the sub-basement blueprints days ago. Measured by the ticking of the internal clock of the manor, the reaction was instantaneous. Somewhere deep within the bowels of the priory, a series of iron plates shifted. The rhythmic thrumming of the pipes accelerated into a high-pitched, screaming hiss. The air in the courtyard began to shimmer, with a sudden, violent heat, and the smell of oxidized copper and whetstone was replaced by the cloying, metallic scent of superheated steam. Verity stood and backed away toward the teak bench, pulling Julian and Silas with her into the deepest corner of the atrium. She did not look at the sky. She looked at the heavy iron security shutters that sealed the threshold to the main house. The pressure was not merely a physical state. It was an accumulation of 20 years of suppressed history, and it required an exit. The 20-year absence of the Duke's shadow was finally at an end as she touched the core of the house's engine. A low subterranean rumble began to shake the courtyard, a vibration so profound it unsettled the moss in the cracks of the stone. Verity watched the seam of the sealed barriers, her eyes narrow and analytical. She was not a woman who believed in miracles. She was a woman who believed in the inevitability of a calculated explosion. Then, the threshold gave way. It was not a slow failure, but a violent, structural rejection. The primary steam pipe behind the library wall, forced beyond its capacity by Verity's manipulation, erupted with a sound like a cannon blast. The force of the pressure burst did not merely push against the iron shutters. It used the narrow vertical volume of the shadow wing as a barrel, focusing the energy directly against the locking mechanisms Sterling had engaged. The iron plates did not just lift, they were torn from their tracks, the heavy metal screeching as it was bent like parchment by the sheer, unbridled force of the vapor. A cloud of white, scalding steam billowed into the atrium. creating a momentary, blinding shroud that tasted of iron and ancient dust. Verity did not scream. She did not panic. She counted the seconds of the release, her hand finding Julian's wrist once more to keep him anchored in the white out. The phantom of the Vane family had haunted these halls for 2 decades, but in the chaos of the steam, Silas Vane was the first to move toward the breach. He did not run like a prisoner escaping a cell. He moved with the predatory grace of a man reclaiming his own skin. Julian followed, his stride fueled by a cold, aristocratic fury that had finally found its target. Verity walked behind them, her lantern held low, her boots clicking through the settling condensation with the same rhythmic precision she had used to measure the ruins. They did not find Arthur Sterling, waiting with a weapon. They found a man who had finally realized that the architecture of his fraud was collapsing under the weight of a single, ink-stained woman's audit. Sterling was standing in the library, his face a mask of ashen terror, as he stared at the twisted iron of the security door, but his gaze did not stay on the debris. It locked onto the 2 identical men emerging from the mist, the Duke and the Shadow, no longer divided by the medicine or the stone. The transition from the ruined library of Thorn Priory to the vaulted, parchment-scented chambers of the Court of Chancery in London was a matter of 3 days and 100 miles of relentless travel. Verity Thorn did not change her dress for the hearing. She remained in her charcoal wool and her travel-stained boots, her fingers still bearing the dark, indelible ink of the gaslight ledger. She sat in the gallery of the mahogany-paneled courtroom, her spine a straight, unyielding line among the sea of silk-clad lawyers and stiff-collared trustees. The air here was heavy with the smell of old wax and the dry, administrative chill of the law. Arthur Sterling sat at the defense table, his composure partially restored by the presence of his legal team, though his eyes darted incessantly toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the chamber. He still believed in the power of the written word. The documents, the charters, and the curated medical records that had sustained his control for 2 decades. The hearing was a display of calculated arrogance. The lead executor stood and spoke for an hour, his voice a smooth, practiced melody of concern for the Duke's failing mental state and the unfortunate delusions triggered by the presence of a meddling surveyor. He produced the medical journals, the ones he had not yet managed to burn, presenting them as proof of a 20-year decline. He spoke of the need for an extended trusteeship for the preservation of the Thorn legacy against the ravages of a broken mind. Verity did not speak. She did not interrupt. She sat with her leather satchel on her lap, her hand resting on the original vellum blueprints she had reclaimed from the rubble. She was counting the lies, waiting for the moment when the pressure of the truth would exceed the capacity of the room to hold it. Then, the doors at the back of the court swung open. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound. It was a physical vacuum that seemed to draw the breath from the lungs of every judge and barrister in the room. Julian Vane, the Duke of Thorn, walked down the center aisle, his posture no longer diminished by the weight of the sedatives. He moved with a terrifying rhythmic clarity, his winter-gray eyes fixed on Arthur Sterling with the intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. But he did not walk alone. Beside him, dressed in an identical suit of black wool, walked Silas Vane. The Duke's shadow had been missing for 20 years. It returned the moment they stepped into the light of the law. The visual shock was a structural failure for the defense. The judges leaned forward, their faces reflecting a profound, bewildered disbelief as they looked at the 2 identical men standing before the bench. It was a matter of physical evidence that no medical journal could erase. Julian did not wait for the court to find its voice. He stepped to the witness stand and placed the original estate deed and Verity Thorn's survey maps onto the railing. He made no mention of ghosts. He uttered no word of hallucinations. He spoke of the 15% discrepancy in the masonry and the parallel house built into the walls of his heritage. He spoke of a brother kept in the dark to ensure a financial dominance that was never earned. Silas Vane stood beside him, a silent, living testament to the fraud. He did not need to speak. His very presence was an audit of Arthur Sterling's soul. The head executor's composure did not merely crack, it disintegrated. Sterling's stood, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a dying animal, his mouth opening to offer a final, desperate justification. But the words did not come. He looked at the twins, the man he had drugged and the man he had imprisoned. And he saw the end of his stewardship written in their identical, unforgiving gazes. The law was no longer a tool he could manipulate. It had become the engine of his own destruction. Verity Thorne watched from the gallery as the court issued the emergency decree, dissolving the trusteeship and ordering the immediate arrest of the executors for fraud and systematic endangerment. She did not cheer. She did not smile. She watched as the bailiffs led Sterling away, the clink of his handcuffs a rhythmic, satisfying finality that matched the ticking of the courtroom's grandfather clock. The ledger of the Vane family was finally in perfect balance. The shadow had been returned to the light, and the man who had curated the darkness was being led into it. It was a matter of records, and the records had finally been verified. 3 weeks later, the restoration of Thorne Priory began in earnest, but it was not a restoration of the past. Verity stood on the east terrace, her surveyor's chain coiled neatly at her feet, looking out over the sprawling estate as the morning frost began to melt into the soil. The iron gates had been repaired, the boxwood hedges trimmed, and the scent of medicinal tonics had been replaced by the smell of wood smoke and fresh lavender. Julian Vane and Silas Vane stood together near the fountain, their silhouettes indistinguishable in the soft morning light. They were no longer a duke and a shadow. They were two men who had inherited a ruin and were building a home from the pieces. Julian walked toward her, his stride steady and his winter-grey eyes filled with a warm, expansive serenity that Verity had once thought impossible. He did not offer her a purse of gold or a hollow title of gratitude. He stopped before her and looked at her ink-stained fingers, the calluses she had earned in the service of his truth. The Duke's shadow had been absent for 20 years, yet it returned the moment she reached through his dissociative fog, and the man had stayed because she had truly seen him. "The work is done." "Verity," Julian said, his voice a low, melodic thrum that matched the quiet pulse of the revitalized house. "The discrepancy has been corrected. The shadow wing is no longer a prison. Silas has opened the windows to the gardens. We are no longer missing any part of ourselves." Verity observed the house, noting the way the new limestone matched the old, the joists now secure, and the load-bearing walls, finally carrying the weight they were intended for. She did not speak of love, she did not speak of the future. She focused on the Duke, her spine a straight, dignified line. "The ledger is balanced, Your Grace," she replied, her voice crisp and poised. "Every debt has been paid, and every room has been accounted for. It was a matter of stewardship, after all." She picked up her satchel, the weight of her brass calipers a comforting pressure against her hip. She had come to Thorne Priory to audit a ruin, and she was leaving having built a kingdom of truth. Justice was a slow-burn restoration, but the results were undeniable. As she walked toward the carriage, the rhythmic clicking of her boots against the gravel sounded a final, triumphant chime. Julian and his brother watched her go, two parts of a whole finally at peace. The restoration was complete, the reckoning was over, and for the first time in 20 years, the silence at Thorne Priory was not an absence but a presence. It was finally home.